The wind was a constant, cruel sculptor of dust and despair on the high plains. It tore at the canvas of the flimsy tent she had managed to erect, a meager shelter against the vast, indifferent sky. Inside, the air was thin and cold, tasting of grit and desperation. Alara hugged her knees to her chest, the rough wool blanket a poor defense against the chill that seeped into her bones. Every ache in her body was a testament to the journey, the loss, the sheer impossibility of her situation. Her supplies were dwindling, a grim count that tightened a knot in her stomach. She had fled, leaving behind a life of privilege, yes, but also one that had become suffocating, treacherous. She sought anonymity, a chance to simply be, away from the weight of a name that had become a burden. But freedom, she was quickly learning, demanded a different kind of currency, resilience she wasn't sure she possessed. Her gaze drifted to the tethered shape just outside the tent. The mustang, wild, unbroken, a creature of raw power and untamed spirit. It was her only real asset, her last hope for mobility, for reaching somewhere, anywhere, that offered more than this desolate stretch of land. Taming it felt like taming the storm inside herself, a monumental, terrifying task. Days bled into weeks, each one a monotonous cycle of hunger, cold, and the exhausting, futile attempts to approach the skittish animal. It watched her with intelligent, wary eyes, nostrils flaring at her scent. Sometimes, she'd just sit, wrapped in the blanket, and talk to it in soft, low tones. Words meant more to soothe her own ragged nerves than to reach the wild creature. She spoke of the life she'd left, the expectations, the crushing weight of a legacy she hadn't asked for. She spoke of the fear that gnawed at her, the profound loneliness that was a physical ache. She spoke of the small, fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could face this wilderness together. She had seen him before, a solitary figure on the horizon, riding the fence line of his own spread. A small, weather-beaten cabin was visible in the distance, smoke sometimes curling from its chimney, a tiny beacon of human presence in this emptiness. He was a man who seemed carved from the same stone as the land itself. Stoic, silent, observant. She avoided his gaze, fearful of intrusion, of judgment, of the questions she couldn't answer. She wanted no connection, only solitude and the chance to disappear. But the land itself was a formidable antagonist, testing her every hour. A sudden sickness had left her weak, the last of her salted meat gone bad. She huddled in the tent, shivering, the mustang's occasional snort the only sound against the howling wind. That was when she saw him dismount near her camp, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't approach the tent directly. Instead, he knelt by the small, dying fire pit she hadn't had the strength to maintain, adding wood methodically. He boiled water in a dented pot he carried, the aroma of brewed herbs reaching her. He left the pot near the tent flap and retreated, mounting his horse without a word, disappearing back towards his cabin. It was a gesture so quiet, so unexpected, that it brought a hot sting to her eyes. He offered no help, demanded no explanation, simply provided what was needed and left. The broth was bitter but warmed her, settling her stomach. It was a small crack in the wall of her despair, a hint that perhaps, even here, in this harsh and unforgiving place, a sliver of quiet kindness could exist. The fear remained, a cold knot, but beside it, a tiny, tentative sprout of something else began to grow. Curiosity about the silent man, and a renewed, fierce determination to survive. The mustang watched, its ears flicking, as if sensing the subtle shift in the air. The man's name, she learned much later, was Elias Thorne. He was a widower, they said in the infrequent, hushed whispers that reached her from the distant, dusty town she avoided. His wife and daughter were gone, taken by the fever years ago. It had left him hollowed out, they claimed, retreating into the vast solitude of his land, interacting with the world only when absolutely necessary. His initial, wordless aid was not repeated directly, but a pattern emerged. A small sack of flour left tied to a fence post a quarter-mile away. a bundle of dried herbs placed strategically near where she foraged for meager roots, a broken hinge on her tent flap, mended overnight with practiced hands. He was a phantom benefactor, his presence marked only by his quiet repairs and offerings, never by conversation. She began to watch him too from a distance, saw him mending fences with economic movements, tending to his small herd of cattle, his back straight, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years spent battling the elements and the land itself. She still struggled with the Mustang. It was a dance of frustration and small, fragile victories. She spent hours simply sitting near it, letting it get used to her presence. She learned to read its moods, the twitch of an ear, the tension in its powerful muscles, the wary flick of its tail. There were days of crushing failure, when the horse would bolt at her approach, leaving her feeling defeated and foolish. But there were also moments of fragile progress, when it wouldn't shy away quite so quickly, when it allowed her to remain within a few feet, its intelligent eyes fixed upon her. She started to see him watching her attempts. He never offered advice, never interfered. But sometimes, after she had spent hours trying to approach the horse with a rope, he would ride by, and she would notice, later, a subtle change. A well-placed branch removed from the ground that might have startled the horse. A small pool of water left nearby that might draw it closer. His help was indirect, a silent commentary on her efforts, nudging her towards success without ever taking the task from her hands. It was a form of communication she was slowly beginning to understand. His silence was not indifference, but perhaps a different language entirely, one of shared space, mutual observation, and quiet respect for the struggle. She stopped talking to the horse about her past and started talking about the present, the wind, the clouds, the stubbornness of the grass, the shared challenge of their existence here. And sometimes, when she was alone but felt his distant presence, she would find herself addressing him in her thoughts, explaining her frustrations, her tiny triumphs. The loneliness began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination, fueled by the unseen partnership. One afternoon, a sudden dust storm swept across the plains, visibility dropping to near zero. She scrambled to secure her tent, but the wind was brutal. Just as a gust threatened to rip the canvas, a figure appeared through the swirling dust, moving with swift purpose. Elias Thorne. He worked alongside her wordlessly, his strength and knowledge anchoring the tent against the gale. For the first time, they were side by side, battling a common foe. The storm raged, forcing them into the small, cramped shelter. The Mustang, spooked by the weather, strained against its tether. Inside the tent, huddled together against the wind's fury, the silence between them was different. No longer born of distance, but of shared vulnerability. The air was thick with the smell of dust, wet canvas, and the quiet intensity of their breathing. She looked at him, really looked. His face was weathered, etched with lines of hardship and sorrow, but his eyes, when they met hers briefly, held a steady, unwavering calm. In that moment, fear warred with a strange sense of safety. When the storm finally abated, leaving the world coated in a fine layer of dust and the air heavy with the scent of rain that hadn't quite fallen, a new phase began. He didn't retreat this time. He stayed, his presence near the camp a quiet, solid anchor. He started bringing his horse over, a gentle mare, letting it graze near the Mustang. It was a silent lesson in calm presence, a way to show the wild horse that humans and their domesticated companions weren't inherently threats. He still didn't offer direct instructions often, but his actions were a masterclass. He showed her how to approach the Mustang with a steady hand, how to read its body language more accurately, when to push and when to retreat. He demonstrated simple rope techniques, his movements economical and patient. He spoke only when necessary, his voice low and gravelly, offering concise observations. Steady now. Let him come to you, or watch the ears. Tells you everything. She was a quick study, her desperation lending her focus and determination. Her progress accelerated. The Mustang, cautiously at first, began to accept her presence. Then her touch. The first time she managed to place a halter on its head. A thrill went through her that rivaled any triumph from her previous life. It wasn't wealth or status, but a fundamental connection, a hard-won victory against the odds. Elias watched these moments with that same quiet intensity, a flicker of something akin to approval in his eyes. They began to share the simple rhythm of the days, sunup to sundown, working separately but together in the vast expanse. Sometimes, they would sit near her small fire in the evenings, eating the simple fare they shared: beans, coffee, sometimes a rabbit he'd caught. The conversation was still sparse, punctuated by long silences. She learned about the land through his eyes, the subtle signs of changing weather, the habits of the wildlife, the history etched into the rocks and canyons. He asked her nothing about her past, and she offered nothing. The privacy was a silent agreement, a foundation of their unusual bond. He knew she wasn't from this world, her hands too soft at first, her language too refined even in its sparseness. She knew he carried a weight of his own, the unspoken grief that resided in the lines around his eyes and the quiet solitude he wore like a cloak. One evening, sitting by the fire, the mustang finally tethered calmly nearby, no longer fighting the rope. A sense of cautious hope settled over her. She had done it. With his help, yes, but through her own perseverance. The horse was not fully broken, but it was accepting, beginning to trust. It felt like a metaphor for her own journey, from wild, panicked flight to a fragile, tentative trust in the possibility of a new life. Elias stirred the fire, the embers casting dancing shadows on his face. The silence stretched, comfortable rather than tense. It felt like a moment of transition, the culmination of weeks of shared effort. It was time. She owed him, not just for his help with the horse, but for the quiet strength he had offered, the unspoken belief he seemed to have in her ability to survive. It was a debt that couldn't be repaid with coin, only with truth. She took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. The words felt strange on her tongue, belonging to a different time, a different person. "Elias," she began, her voice soft but steady in the quiet night. He turned his head, his gaze meeting hers across the small fire. Expectant, but still unreadable. I need to tell you something," she paused, gathering her courage. The name felt heavy, capable of shattering the fragile peace they had built. "My name. The name I was born with. The name the world knows. It's Eleanor Vance." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackling fire and the soft breathing of the horses nearby. Eleanor Vance. A name that conjured images of gilded ballrooms, political power, newspaper headlines, and a notorious scandal that had rocked society. A name that belonged to a woman who was supposed to be somewhere else entirely, living a life of prescribed duty and privilege, not huddled by a fire on the desolate plains with a quiet widower and a half-tamed mustang. She watched his face closely, searching for a reaction. His expression remained stoic, but she saw a subtle shift in his eyes, a dawning recognition, perhaps. He knew the name. Everyone did. The initial shock, if it was there, was masterfully concealed. He didn't speak immediately, letting the weight of the revelation settle between them. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry grass. Finally he spoke, his voice still low, measured. "Vance," it wasn't a question, more a simple acknowledgement. He didn't ask why she was here, or how she had fallen so far from that world. He didn't express surprise or judgment. He simply accepted the information, processing it through the lens of his own silent understanding of hardship and lost lives. "The world, it had expectations," she continued, feeling a surprising need to explain, to bridge the gap the name had created. "They became impossible to bear. I had to leave." He nodded slowly, his gaze holding hers. There was no pity there, only that same quiet understanding. He knew about burdens, about lives irrevocably changed by circumstances beyond one's control. His silence was an invitation to continue, but also a reassurance that the name, while significant, didn't change the person he had come to know by the fire, the woman who had faced down fear and wrestled determination from despair. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For the quiet help, for the patience, for not asking. He inclined his head slightly. Everyone has their reasons, he said simply. The horse, he's a good one, strong. He just needed someone to show him how to trust. His words hung in the air, a clear parallel to her own journey. The mustang, now settled, snorted softly, as if in agreement. It was no longer just a wild animal to be conquered, but a companion, a testament to their shared effort. Eleanor looked at the horse, then back at Elias. The harshness of the land hadn't changed, nor had the challenges she still faced. But she was different. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it no longer paralyzed her. The vulnerability was still there, but it was tempered by a newfound strength, forged in the crucible of hardship and quiet human connection. Her past, represented by the famous name, felt distant, a life lived by someone else. This life, here on the plains, was raw and difficult, but it was hers, and she wasn't entirely alone. Resilience wasn't the absence of fear, she realized, but the willingness to keep moving, to keep trying, even when every instinct screamed for surrender. It was in the quiet strength of a man who had lost everything but still found a way to offer kindness. It was in the trust of a wild creature that had finally lowered its guard. It was in herself, the woman who had fled a gilded cage only to find a different kind of freedom, one measured not in wealth or status, but in dignity, quiet courage, and the enduring, silent language of shared survival. The stars were coming out overhead, vast and indifferent, but beneath them, by the fire, a fragile hope burned steady and true.